Hello, welcome to Books and Company. I'm Ron Carlson, and today our guest is the writer Peter Baird, who's here with his novel Beyond Peleliu. Now, you have a book that is suggested by your life, framed at certain moments, which is a great help to a writer, I think. Obviously colored by memory, its reliability and its unreliability. But you write scenes which probably took place, but you weren't present.
That's correct.
And so what is a writer's responsibility in a scene with, for example, when your parents met and so on, and you create these scenes? Do you just take a deep breath, let go, and do your best, or?
No, I did more than that. Of course I did that.
Yeah.
A lot of deep breaths. It took me 14 years to write this. But I did research into the times. I would go back and read the microfilm of the newspaper headlines at those times. I knew where they had met. I did research into every aspect that was accessible to me. And it was fun. Also, there were some old home movies that I could watch. And the best part of it was I could see that my parents loved each other, which was, as I grew up, there was considerable doubt about that. And so as I went along, as I mentioned earlier, I learned as much about myself as I did about my parents.
Right. So you have historical data that you're trying to bring to life by a drama.
That's right.
And you're making these scenes up. You're writing characters, you're writing men, you're writing women, you're writing all of the energy that has fiction. But you know, Peter, you're a lawyer.
Right. I admit to that.
Yeah.
I waive my Fifth Amendment rights. I'll admit to that.
Tell me, how does a lawyer who deals with deducing from evidence and working and laying things out congruently according to the facts, then make that leap into fiction?
I've always loved to write. And even when I was a kid, I worked for the small-town newspaper in our hometown. I've always loved to write and write stories, little stories, ditties, whatever. And I started writing for legal magazines and legal journals that nobody read except the linotype operators. Then I started writing personal things, and I became captivated by the personal essay style from Joseph Epstein, from Philip Lapote, from Russell Baker, and those. And I was drawn to the personal essay style because it's so authentic. It's short. There's no place for digressionary adverbs and unnecessary descriptions. It's as true and immediately apparently true as anything I could imagine. And then I started reading Raymond Carver. I even read Ron Carlson, by the way, just to throw you a rose, but it was helpful.
Then you began reading fiction writers. I see.
To me, someone like Raymond Carver is so authentic and so basic and so close to the earth with his writing that it rings true,
right, without
his showing off that he can write with flourishes and turns of phrase, right, which distract me. So I started writing personal essays. And I was rejected probably about a gazillion times, but finally I wrote for the New York Times magazine about men column. I wrote for Newsweek. I wrote for the Chicago Tribune magazine. I wrote for the Wall Street Journal. And that started to accumulate to the point that I had an agent who said, I think you can write a novel, and I'd never thought about that in my whole life. And so at a very despairing point in my life, my marriage was falling apart, I was seriously depressed. I've always been able to be energized and my mood elevated by the act of writing and creating. And so when I hit bottom, I decided that I would take by this point, a mass of published personal essays, thinking stupidly that I could connect them by some kind of silly bridge here and maybe a back scene right, there. Sure. And what I ended up with was a total mess.
Sure.
And but I kept learning by failing and by researching and by getting down to the raw realities of what had happened. I eliminated all flashbacks. I remember vividly doing that, throwing about 200 pages into one wastebasket in the middle of the night. And then I started researching, and the research into the times, into the battle scenes, and into the medical scenes, because the surgery and the polio and all of these conditions were medical conditions that I knew about. But I didn't know, for example, how a surgeon does a thoracotomy. So I had a great deal of fun. It elevated my mood, and eventually, I have a novel.
One of the most interesting and riveting characters in your book is the mother.
Yes.
And, but, you know, she's a magician.
Yes.
And they meet. She meets her husband, the father.
That's correct.
Because she's a magician.
That's right.
Is this drawn from life? I mean,
Yes, it is. I don't know how they met.
It seems stranger than fiction.
Yeah, and I love doing that because my mother, who died when I was a child, was a magician. She was a graduate of Northwestern University, social worker. And she worked on Hull House in Chicago during the settlement house movement, and then she worked in the Dwight Women's Prison, and she was assigned to what was called the street fraud, swindles, that sort of thing. And they apparently took her under their wing and taught her all of these things that look like mind reading but are real scams.
Like the trick in the book where she writes the thing in the envelope?
That's right. And all of the magic in the book that Virginia does can be done, and I do it. So that has a certain immediacy to it that it was fun to write about. But it is more than just the trickery, it is also the metaphoric impact of magic, because there is revealing and coming together in forgiveness and reconciliation. The book, in my judgment, what I set out to try to do, was the magic of love as it can finally triumph over pain, depression, hate, and all sorts of scandalous things that happened in my life and in the book that is traceable back to the September 1944 Battle of Peleliu.
Yeah, that's interesting. You use that as a galvanizing moment. The other moments in the current story are the father's involvement with the polio vaccine.
That's right.
And that actually, talk about that for a second?
My father, I had polio, and I was crippled for about 3.5 months. And then shortly after that, the Salk vaccine came out. And my father was one of the physicians who was given the initial batch of Cutter Salk vaccine by the Cutter Laboratories, which had in it live virus. So he was injecting live polio virus into the children of our town. And you can imagine not only the tragedy of these children, but how my father felt as having been the one who injected the virus into them. And that was a very poignant time in my life and for him, and it certainly did nothing to improve his disposition or his self-loathing or his depression.
It's a powerful part of the book, too. Very, very tragic turn.